Hello, this is Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, hosting once again the Building Local Power podcast. Welcome back to another episode. Today I'm speaking with Vanessa Williamson, a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
We're going to talk about taxes today, and one of the reasons is because you wrote this book that I think is an eye-opener and is highly recommended for people to open. It's called Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes. Can you just say maybe a word about why you wrote an entire book about this subject?
Well, I realized in my previous work being on the Tea Party that there was a lot of work looking at what people on the far right think about taxes, or at least sort of extremes of the political spectrum a little bit, maybe. But we didn't actually know very much about what most people think about taxes. And I also noticed in trying to look into the question that we tend to ask Americans the same questions over and over and over again about taxes that rich people pay. We very rarely ask about taxes that most people pay. So I thought there was really room for a much broader and also, in a sense, a deeper study of what Americans think, not assuming that they have particular policy knowledge, but actually sort of delving into their experience of taxpaying and how that shapes their knowledge.
And so what we're going to be talking about, a lot of the opinions, you didn't just do studies, you really did a lot of in-depth research over many years to try and just briefly, why should people think that you have a good handle on what Americans think about taxes?
Yeah, so I spent about 6 years studying the subject, looking at what Americans think about taxes in surveys, in interviews, at the voting booth when they get to vote on state and local tax measures, in public statements and letters to the editor, basically any handle I could get on an opportunity where individual Americans got to share their views on taxation.
You convinced me. and I just know that this is a methodology that I've seen in other books as well that really tracked well with getting at a true understanding, not just someone thinking on a survey, I'm just going to click a button or something like that. I just wanted to get a couple of quick facts. I think many of us remember that 47% figure from the 2012 election, suggesting that 47% of Americans just don't pay taxes. Who pays taxes in the United States of America?
The 47% statistic is accurate as far as it goes, in the sense that 40% of income tax filing households do not have a net federal income tax liability. Right? That's a lot smaller, though, than 47% of Americans. In fact, because we pay many, many kinds of taxes, including income taxes, payroll taxes, sale taxes, gas taxes, property taxes, and many more, almost every, not just American, almost every resident of the United States, almost every person who goes into a coffee shop and buys a cup of coffee pays taxes. So we're all taxpayers by any reasonable standard. But there's a lot of attention on the federal income tax, and so sometimes people think that if you don't pay much or you don't pay anything in federal income tax, you don't pay taxes at all, and that's just not true.
Well, one of the things that I found particularly interesting with some of your interviews was the language associated with paying taxes. And I wrote a few of them down. People viewed it as an important civic duty, a duty just like voting, an obligation linked to political voice. Did any of the interviews really struck you that you still think about in terms of how they viewed paying taxes?
Yeah, this was something that I wasn't expecting, honestly, although the survey data would actually support it, but I thought those were weakly held opinions. Again and again, when I ask people, is it your responsibility to pay taxes, or is it okay to, hold back a little bit here and there, especially because the government's so wasteful or something like that, people said no. People really do see in America tax paying as an important civic commitment because they see it as a symbol of being an upstanding citizen, of being the kind of person who contributes to your community. And, I was struck by it over and over again, all over the political spectrum. I remember speaking to a former Marine who's actually a very politically progressive person, and I asked what taxes are, what he thought of when he heard the word taxes, and he said, oh, well, it's the cost of being an American. And, for someone who's quite obviously made a much larger commitment, frankly, to America, it really struck me. And I remember I talked to a mailman who was a very conservative guy in Ohio, and I asked him, so how do you feel when you're paying your federal income taxes? A very standard question that I would ask. And I was expecting, an opportunity. This was an opportunity to rail against government, but instead, he talked about it as part of his duty, as part of his responsibility. He was upholding a responsibility that was his job. So I was really surprised by how overwhelming the American commitment is to the idea of taxpaying.
that tracks with my experience. And I have a somewhat unique experience because I have a business that has income that is not withheld. So I have my job with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and then I also run a business doing sports photography for a number of clients. And I had a really good year one year, and the accountant says, "Chris, I'm sorry, but you had a really good year this previous year." And I had to write a check that was very large to the federal government in April. And, for me, I sort of knew it was coming. I didn't know it would be that large. And one of the things that you say in the introduction really struck with me, which is the value of what I'm getting. And I love this country. I've traveled around the world a fair amount. And you talk about how, it's hard to place a value on what people are getting for their taxes, what the value of winning World War II was in relation to veterans' benefits and things like that. And I just think that really struck with me because, it is painful. I would have rather spent that money on something else, probably a brand new lens for my camera. But it's something that really, I can't describe the amount of value I get. And I would pay more if I had to stay here. If they said, we're going to double your tax bill or you're going to leave the country, I would not be happy, right? But I would pay twice as much to stay here. So there's just some thoughts that I have about that sort of, the similar sentiment.
Well, what struck me is how many Americans hold views that are along those lines, but they think they're alone. They think they're the only one in the world who holds that sentiment. And, it's not always quite as, that is a very generous sentiment that you're expressing, right? But the idea that, it's your job to give something back and that you are grateful for things that this country has given you, Americans really believe that. And they believe it both widely in the sense that, 95% of Americans will agree with the idea that it's your civic duty to pay your fair share of taxes. But they also agree with it deeply in the sense that I didn't seek out people's civic responsibilities when I started this. I was cynical about that. I thought that was not a widely held view, but people bring it up when you talk to them. And one way that you can see it is actually in the amount of anger people express about tax paying, because what they express anger about is not typically the amount they themselves pay, but the idea that someone else isn't paying their share. And that is just the flip side, right? If you think you're doing your responsible act, right, the idea that someone else is skipping out is really upsetting.
Right, and that brings us to, in some ways, why this is so relevant for the audience that is listening to this, as we traditionally conceive of them. We talk a lot about monopolies, and I think we have a sense that monopolies, for instance, are not paying their fair share. AT&T, Verizon often seem like they go years where they don't pay any income taxes. Trying to be more specific about it, because I'm sure they pay some taxes. I hope they pay some taxes. But it's important to think about these feelings because when we're proposing, as we often do in this show, government programs to be able to rectify some of the failings of the marketplace or the failings of previous government policies, we need to power the government with something. One of the things that I've heard in terms of a solution to monopoly would be government having more independent research that's not industry funded. Well, that would cost a lot of money, which would probably come from taxes. So ergo, taxes are an important piece of the conversation. We believe in economic opportunities for everyone and recognize that some households, whether due to historic marginalization, bad luck, or even some bad choices, need some form of help. So all of these reasons are why we need to pay attention to the revenue coming in. But one of the things that I've heard from people that I respect in response to some of this is, well, if people believe so strongly in paying taxes, why do we see such resistance to it? And in fact, it seems like if you want to attack Democrats, you attack them for the way they spend taxpayer dollars and the fact that they're willing to raise it. Republicans have run for decades on being a party that will only ever lower taxes. And in fact, the one president that was a Republican in my lifetime who was somewhat responsible on the deficit, George H.W. Bush, is considered a joke and a terrible Republican because he dared to raise taxes. So how do we square that circle?
Yeah, so I think that a common mistake in sort of the way that we talk about politics is to imagine that our political outcomes represent the views of most people. And we know that that's not true when we stop to examine it. It's not true on taxes. Most Americans are not particularly upset about the amount of taxes they pay. In fact, if you ask people what bothers them about taxes, you'll get somewhere, 8 or 10% of Americans say the amount they pay. 2/3 of Americans say that they're angry that the wealthy or corporations are not paying their share. right? And what did we get? We get a tax bill that cuts taxes at the top and doesn't give much of a break to anyone else anyway. So why do we see that? Well, we see that because our government doesn't do a very good job of representing majority views. Partly it was designed not to do a good job of representing majority views, right? But it's no less the case that Americans want sensible gun control simply because we don't get it, right? It's not, people have strongly held views about, for instance, raising the minimum wage. That's not why we don't get it. The problem in our politics is not best explained by an individual level failure on the part of voters. It is best explained by a series of systematic failures in how we aggregate votes, in how we channel the voices of not very powerful individuals into very powerful institutions.
Does it also have an effect that most people seem to think that the wealthy actually pay far less in taxes than they do? And we can talk about fair share and where that's set. But I wonder sometimes when someone like me goes around saying, oh, there's all these loopholes, I feel like actually people that are listening sometimes they overestimate the number of loopholes and the amount that the wealthy pay.
A majority of Americans, in fact, a strong majority of Americans, support progressive taxation, right? They think that wealthy people should pay more than lower income people, and they think that they should pay more as a percentage, not just as a dollar amount, right? But among people who support a flat tax, a fair amount of that support comes from people who think a flat tax would raise taxes on the rich. Now, why? Previous survey work hadn't been able to figure this out. I looked at it in interviews, and it looks pretty convincing to me that one reason for that is because people know that taxes are nominally progressive. The federal income tax is a progressive tax, and the rates go up, but they think it's undermined by loopholes, exactly as you say. So they think, well, if we had a flat tax with no loopholes, maybe we'd actually get those rich people who have managed to lower their tax responsibilities to zero in their minds, right? As a whole, the sort of upper income people, if you're talking about the top 20% of people, actually do pay quite a lot in taxes. As a whole, our tax system is more progressive than many tax systems in Europe because we rely heavily on an income tax. And that's true right up till you get to the very, 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 very rich, right? So you're $60 million or more a year. Well, okay, there it's actually begins to become hard to even measure what someone's income is, right? But for the majority of people, the tax system is indeed progressive. You make more money, you pay more money, and you pay more money as a percentage. But I think it is a problem that, especially on the left, we talk a lot about loopholes and, oh, loopholes are bad. And of course, loopholes are bad, but they don't actually undermine the progressive tax code. And I think that sometimes we're actually doing ourselves a damage in terms of talking about who pays what when we focus so strongly on loopholes.
So your office is here in Northwest Washington, D.C., a section of D.C. associated with fairly progressive liberal ideas and that sort of thing. I'm sure being in Washington, D.C., you know a lot of more liberal type folks. Do these findings about people's willingness to pay for government, and in fact the number one complaint basically being that other people aren't paying their fair share, do you feel like you're a crazy person among a bunch of people where, I mean, on the left, I think there's a broad idea that most Americans are individualistic. They hate government. They don't want to deal with government at all and that sort of thing. And I agree with you regarding the need to improve the outcomes of government. And I agree with your assessment as to why that often doesn't happen. But it does seem to me like the left is convinced, and the right also, that Americans simply don't want government at all almost.
So I think that it's fair to say that Americans are what's called philosophical conservatives and operational liberals, right? So if you ask people, do they think government should be small, they tend to say, yes, that's right. But if you ask them, should government invest in more in things like Social Security, Medicare, education, helping the poor, people say yes, and they even say they'd pay more for it, right? So in sort of broad strokes, Americans do like this sort of language of individualism. Yes, that's absolutely true. But if you ask them on any specifics, well, actually they like a really strong welfare state, right? And I think that there is a tendency, especially, in the kind of place that I live, to blame bad political outcomes on sort of a failure of individual people and to sort of denigrate the capacity of average Americans to understand politics or to engage in politics. And I think and that's the way that I feel like I'm shouting in the wilderness when I say, actually, I went around and interviewed and surveyed Americans as close to a representative group as I could manage, and I came away impressed and heartened.
Right. Many people are quite reasonable when you talk to them face to face.
Exactly. And, it is absolutely not reflected in our politics. It is true.
Right. The thing that surprised me the most in your work and research was the extent to which I feel that people who feel that they don't pay taxes or they don't pay enough taxes feel like their political voice should not matter. I think I would argue that their voice does not matter, and I'm frustrated with that. I want to find ways to fix it. They weren't arguing my voice doesn't matter because I'm marginalized. They were arguing I don't pay much in taxes, and therefore maybe my views should not matter as much. I found that very disappointing in some ways.
Yeah, so a side effect of the sort of focus nationally on the federal income tax, which is a tax that is progressive and low or negative for low-income people and high for at least most of the upper income spectrum until you get to the very top. The focus on that tax is the thing that qualifies you as a taxpayer, leaves many low-income people feeling they don't deserve to be heard, right? And I heard this over and over again. In interviews, I'd be talking to a lower-income person, and they would say, oh, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to talk to. I don't really pay taxes. And sometimes this was with someone who had only a few minutes earlier been talking to me about how hard it was to get the money together to cover the sales tax on their groceries. And if you're talking about taxes in terms of hardship imposed, the $2,000 we take out of the income of a person making $20,000 is infinitely more hardship than the taxes I pay, which are, of course, higher in amount and percentage, but not higher in actual cost.
Well, you make this point very well, I think, and I was impressed the extent to which it seems almost every American that is from a household that's struggling this way can do math immediately in their head in the sales tax, right? I mean, these are people that are calculating out to the penny what the sales tax will be on these various items in their carts, to the extent that I'm just glad that I don't have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially in the states that I love taxes. I'm in favor of taxes. My mug in front of me right now says, I heart taxes. It is true. But there are two kinds of tax I don't like, obviously, the poll tax and the tax on groceries. Because you can't talk to poor Americans at all about what it's like to go to a grocery store and not think that it's shameful, that we're taking a month's worth of grocery money out of the budget of people who are barely making ends meet. And that's, the amount of sort of pain that's involved when people have to make those calculations in their head, as you say, on their way to the counter so they don't have the embarrassment of having to put things back. That's just unconscionable to me.
And connecting to the previous thought then, and yet they still walk away thinking, I don't pay taxes, and therefore, I'm not as important perhaps as someone who pays a lot of taxes.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a real mistake that we make taxes that are very expensive for many people, sales tax, payroll taxes, so invisible, and make the federal income tax so controversial. It really, I think, misleads people about the distribution of tax responsibility in this country.
For people who want to read the book, this is the kind of prose that you'll get summing this up. Because taxpaying is seen as an emblem of civic worthiness, denying the poor the status of taxpayers has the effect of denying their political standing. Classing a large percentage of the populace as a kind of second-class citizenry is genuinely toxic for democratic norms. It's really worth noting, as for people who are listening to this show, who in many cases are involved in their communities of how to build movements and things like that, I just feel like it's really important to address those sorts of issues, because we often wonder how these people aren't more politically active, given the role that government programs play in their lives, the way that these programs are under threat. I think this is a part of the explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think so. I certainly wanted part of the purpose of the book to be to draw attention to the taxpaying experience of most Americans, which is not all about April 15th every year. Although actually that can be a real boon to low-income families. But yeah, I think that rightly or wrongly, Americans see taxpaying as this important responsibility that's tied up with being a citizen. In fact, that's something that's lasted throughout our history. A piece of work that I have not yet done, but a sort of a follow-on to the book, is looking at how taxpayers have been represented throughout American history, going back obviously to the founding and taxation and representation. But if you look at the women's movement, if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at immigrants' rights movements today, people who have been refused the status of citizen or full citizen often describe themselves as taxpayer and use that status as sort of a way of advocating for more complete representation. So I think it's a really important part of our history.
Absolutely, and I'm reminded of a discussion I had with a woman on the city council of San Antonio, where they work without pay, and you often hear from constituents, I pay your salary, and she'd have to remind people, actually, you don't. I volunteer in this capacity, but nonetheless, you are my constituent. I take your views seriously, that sort of thing. But you hear that constantly from people who are frustrated with their elected officials of, I pay the bills around here, and to some extent, they're certainly right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is good for Americans to think about taxes as the part of their labor that they contribute to the public good. I think that is a powerful way to think. But you have to remember everyone else is chipping in too. I mean, you pay a very marginal amount of any civil servant's taxes, right? And it doesn't actually matter how much you're paying because you're, a citizen and a resident and you deserve to be heard. But I think that, I think that there is something powerful in the American psyche about the idea that this is the part of my work that I gave to all of us.
One of the powerful ideas that seems not to go away and is very important is correlated with race. And one of the findings that you had, which I did not find surprising, unfortunately, is that there is a correlation between people who are anti-African American, who presumably were willing to tell surveys or otherwise be open with those views, and being anti-tax. And in some ways, it actually seems like it fits because it also seems like anti-American, and at least the America that I want to live in.
Yeah, I mean, this is a long trend in American history. I told the positive story a second ago about the women's movement, the civil rights movement, right? But the counter movements to all of those movements also talked about taxes. You see anti-immigrant activists talk all the time about, they're here, they're not paying taxes, which is not true and is in fact, my book has a lot of counterintuitive findings, but the one that I have consistently had a hard time convincing people who don't agree with me on is that undocumented people pay taxes. And that's just a fact. Like, that's not a complicated fact. There are dollars in the Treasury that are the result of undocumented people paying taxes. A lot of those dollars, right? This is not nearly as controversial or complicated as anything else I work on, but it is so hard to convince people of that.
For my job applications, I never saw an opportunity in the I-9 or whatever the form was to check off the I-4. I forget what it is. I am an undocumented immigrant, therefore don't do any withholding.
Yeah, I mean, the withholding, particularly payroll taxes, Social Security benefits, which undocumented people do not qualify, but for which they chip in, they're actually helping keep Social Security afloat right now. Sales taxes obviously apply to anyone who's in the country at the time and in a store. These are not taxes that are avoidable. And so this is a real situation, I think, in which it's sad to discover as a researcher and as a political scientist that, I can come with my pie chart, but it doesn't actually defeat racism, And that is the most disappointing aspect, I think, of the work that I did. There was so much positivity and so much to be hopeful about, but the strength of anti-immigrant sentiment and the racism that's embedded in that is, I think, maybe the great challenge we face. In
your research, in surveying other research in this matter, have you seen anything that helps to deal with that? I mean, in the specific tax space, I don't want to get into fields that you're not as much of an expert in.
Yeah, so I think that on the subject of changing attitudes about taxation, one thing that has at least shown some effect is giving people more information about the taxes they pay. All right, so there have been experiments done, for instance, in providing people, you may have even received one of these, with a statement that told you how much you'd paid into Social Security and how much you could expect to benefit later. There were these green statements that were handed out for a couple of years. The program was unfortunately ended. But they randomized it, so you could actually measure whether people who had received these statements knew more and felt better about things, or worse for that matter. And what they found was that if you'd gotten these statements, you were better informed about Social Security and you felt more positively about the program. So there are ways in which government can sort of be respectful to the people who've chipped in all this cash and tell them more about where that money is going, and that may help. But I think there's a really long and dark history in this country regarding our capacity to see each other as fellow citizens. And an example of that, if you go back even to the end of the Reconstruction, the redemption governments that came into place, the white supremacist governments that came into place at the end of this sort of period of progressive increases in equality across the South, those governments described themselves as rule of the taxpayer, right? And what they meant by that was rule by white plantation owners. And so I'm not sure that the language of taxpaying is the answer, but I'm sure it's the field on which our fights about who counts as a citizen are going to be fought.
one of the hopes that I've had in terms of recent technological fixes is video games, in particular participatory budgeting type stuff where one can try to play around with a budget. Public radio has sometimes hosted these on websites and it help people to get a better sense of where their money's going. Is there any hope for that, or is that something that was just a fad 5 years ago and has disappeared?
I don't know. I'm a Luddite myself, so I tend to be suspicious of all technological solutions, including the ones that I eventually can't do without. So I'm perhaps not the person to ask. But I will say that I think that all endeavors that are directed towards better informing the American citizenry are at least worth trying, right? And particularly when they come from the perspective of that the problems that we face as a country come from a shortage of democracy, a shortage of, deliberative, deep democracy, as opposed to a problem of people participating too much, and we should just leave it all to the experts. To the extent that we're experimenting with new ways to engage people in the politics that genuinely does shape their lives, I think it's worth trying.
And so as we wrap up, I'm curious if you would agree then that for people who, for instance, the people who might think that the future of solving healthcare might involve more government and perhaps higher taxes, for people who, I actually think we can solve rural broadband while lowering the tax burden effectively, because we have misspent so much money in terms of the subsidies to the big companies and phasing it out, I think. But nonetheless, for people who might think that we have to spend more, whether on the federal or the local level, your impression is that people would be receptive to that if they had a faith that the money was going to be well spent, is my impression at least, that people don't feel like they couldn't possibly live if their taxes went up.
Well, I mean, one piece of evidence that suggests that that's the case is if you look at state ballot measures, right? So these are measures at the state level. If you're from California like I am, you are very familiar with ballot measures. Other states also use them. I looked at every state ballot measure that was intended to raise taxes. And 40 years ago, if you put a measure on the ballot to raise taxes, you had about a 1 in 5 chance of that measure passing. These are pretty bad odds, right? Now, in the last 15 years, if you put a measure on a state ballot anywhere in the country that has them, you have about a 1 in 2 chance of that measure passing, which is extremely good by ballot measure standards, right? And this has been a really steady increase over 40 years. So I think what we're seeing is that if you actually ask voters, hey, and you have to go to the voters and say, hey, I want to protect our nurses and teachers, it's going to cost, an extra 0.25 cents when you buy things at the store, or I want to protect nurses and teachers, it's going to involve an increase in our top income tax rate. People sometimes say yes to that. In fact, far more often than you might imagine. So I think, again, it's sort of evidence that if we're looking at why our politics don't reflect most Americans' views on taxation, the problem is in the systems, not in the people.
Well, I think that's right. And I think it's worth noting there's hope out there, and it's in some ways an incentive to get it right, because if we fail to enact the programs that we want to build the society we want to live in, it's not because it was preordained, because we live in a country that's anti-tax. It's because maybe we didn't do a good enough job, and we need to work hard at making sure that we get the things that we want.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Vanessa Williamson joining Christopher Mitchell from the Community Broadband Networks Initiative here at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. This is episode 41 of the Building Local Power podcast. Please take a moment to help us continue to bring high-quality guests like Vanessa to you through this commercial-free podcast by donating at ilsr.org/donate. We encourage you to also connect with us on Twitter and Facebook, and to subscribe to this podcast and our other podcasts, Local Energy Rules and the Community Broadband Bits podcast. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at ilsr.org. Thanks to Dysfunction Al for the music licensed through Creative Commons. The song is Funk Interlude. I'm Lisa Gonzalez from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Thank you for listening to episode 41 of the Building Local Power podcast.